Good morning, Peter. How are you?
Good morning. I am apprehensive, but I'm always apprehensive.
Exactly. That's just normal for you. Yeah. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining the series of Sentientist conversations. And in these conversations, it's centered really around the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real, what should we believe in, and what matters morally? And I'm trying to refine and popularize a really simple worldview called Sentientism, which says we should take a naturalistic approach to deciding what to believe using evidence and reason, as imperfect as those are. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name. We should care about all sentient beings, or any being that has the capacity to experience anything at all. But I'm talking to people in this series with people who disagree with and agree with that philosophy. So it'll be fascinating to see what you think and understand some of your personal philosophical journey and how that fits into your current work too. And cool. I was pointed your direction and first read your work because when I've been working on this amateurish Sentientism project, I was really interested in sci-fi that had explored the boundaries and the nature and the meaning of sentience. And obviously many people led me directly to Blindsight, which is a mind-blowing piece of work, which I loved. So we'll probably come back to some of the themes in that through this conversation. But before we get on to that conversation, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for people who don't know you?
I was raised by Baptists. I was raised by an anomalous kind of Baptist that was convinced of the rightness of his beliefs, that he actually encouraged me to ask questions, even uncomfortable ones.
Interesting.
It's not something I'm used to encountering in religious circles. And to some extent, I don't think he really fully grasped what happened. Just a few months before he died, he actually sent me an email saying that he had let me down because he had taught so many people about the word of God and somehow he had failed to reach me. But he encouraged me to ask questions. So I became a biologist. I was a biologist until around the turn of the century. I fled marine biology because of the political bullshit. I then had, about 8 months before the unemployment checks ran out. And I'd been wanting to be a writer ever since I was 8 years old. So I dove into that, became an author. So I've been a science fiction writer pretty much full time. I've done a little bit of scientific consulting on the side for most of this century. And in a kind of an insecure attempt to maintain some shred of academic credibility, my shtick is to put actual peer-reviewed scientific references at the end of my books so that Brad Adholt and John Richardson and all those people who sneered at me in grad school for playing Dungeons and Dragons while they were trying to get in published in Nature won't lump me in with the child molesters and all the other people that abandoned true academia and real science to write this ray guns and spaceships bullshit. Of course, the ironic thing is that the kind of people who would think that about me would never be caught dead reading my stuff anyhow. So all the references and technical citations are lost. And B, I've actually been published in Nature more than they have because Nature publishes short science fiction stories. And I've been waiting for howls of outrage to reach my ears, but they never have. So I don't know.
And I think if many scientists got a citation from one of your pieces of science fiction, that would mean more to them than a citation from some other piece of science. So,
well,
I think you win either way.
It's one of the coolest things about this gig is that actual scientists will seek me out at cons or will send me emails. And so I've collected this resource base of people with far more insight and expertise than me that I can basically now go to and ask questions to inform my writing, make it a little more realistic and more to the point, act as cannon fodder. If somebody else tells me I'm full of shit, I can say, well, don't talk to me, talk to this guy. He's got 3 dozen laser patents in the office. So yeah, you're talking to him. I don't know if any of these people would have actually agreed to be my muse, my scientific muses, if they knew that was what was in store for them. But it's too late really now. Too late. Yeah. Talk about moral pragmatism. Here's a perfect example.
And you touched already on that first question I like to ask about what's real, in that for many of my guests, it is a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic or a religious context and how that view shifted. And you've hinted already at your journey, but it'd be good to dig a little bit deeper into that. So you grew up in a Baptist context. And did you believe that stuff as a kid and then start asking questions? Or was it always something you were uncertain about?
Well, I think when you're a kid, I think any juvenile mammal who has caregiving parents, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. We don't start from, scratch. We just look around at the nearest mammals that have reached reproductive age, which are obviously our folks. And we emulate what they do because obviously it worked for them.
Yeah.
So I think we're programmed to just basically imitate and imprint. So yeah, obviously that's what I did. I think my dad was a tragic case. He was a minister for the longest time, and then he founded something called the Baptist Leadership Training School. And he was the founder and the principal of that for 22 years. And then they upgraded him, and he became the general secretary of the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec until he retired.
Wow.
At that point, he joined Amnesty International, at which point CSIS, our local intelligence community, got interested in him and put a file out on him because Amnesty International is considered a subversive organization. But anyhow, running through all of this is that he was a rock star in the Bible Belt of southern Alberta, which is pretty fire and brimstone. B, he was gay. And we did not realize this until less than 10 years ago when my brother, who has since died, and I basically had to rescue him from an abusive domestic situation. And his wife tended to beat the shit out of him and then say that if he raised a hand to her, she would call the police and say she was being abused. There was a dementia element in this. She was always an asshole, but she always maintained that charity of Christian, or that facade of Christian charity, until the dementia kicked in. And at that point, the monster beneath emerged. So when things were so bad that we literally had to extract him from his home because he would have to sneak out in the middle of the night and try and feed himself without waking up Fanchon because she wouldn't let him use the kitchen. At that point, he said, "Your mother's had a very hard time of it. You can't really blame her for it. Look what I am. I'm a non-practicing homosexual. I don't call myself gay because it's brought me no happiness at all. And I've never acted on it. And I love your mother, but this is what I am." And it's interesting because I have a few gay friends who actually knew him quite well, and their gaydar never went off at all. Wow, he was deeply undercover. But looking back, the fact that he encouraged me to ask questions, the fact that he was the most unjudgmental man I've ever known. And this is supposed to be a conservative figurehead of the right-wing Baptist church. He caught me reading a James Bond novel when I was a kid. I was, I think, To Russia with Love. And he sat me down and he said, "Ian Fleming really knows how to tell you a good story, but he doesn't treat women very well in his novels. And this would not be a good way. You should not take lessons from this novel other than just as pure escapism," right?
Yeah.
This is a guy working for the Baptist Federation. And there was one point, I guess, the first time I got absolutely blind drunk at a party, and Fanchon's and my mother's immediate concern was whether or not Mr. McBurney from the Deacons Board had seen me drunk. And she was very upset. And dad came home, and I was just lying in my bed spinning. Yeah. And he just came in and lay down in the dark next to me, told me about his day, asked me how his day had gone. And I told him, yeah, I got drunk, which, like, obviously, if he flicked a lighter in the room, the whole place would have gone up. So he obviously knew, but he let me bring it up. And then he rolled his eyes and he gave me some line about how Shakespeare had this great line about what fools men be to put a demon into their mouths to steal away their brains. But it was very kind of rolling his eyes at the sin, but loving the sinner. And I did some things that would embarrass, shall we say, a Baptist minister, just professionally.
Yeah.
As a kid, and he never judged me for it. Looking back now, this whole lack of judgmentalism was stone self-serving because we know what his demons were now. I didn't know this at the time. And maybe that's what religious figureheads all need, is a closeted secret shame, whether it should be a shameful act or not, something that they are afraid of getting out. Perhaps that's something that, on the other hand, look at the US is full of family values Republicans who end up getting caught giving blowjobs in men's washrooms. So it doesn't always work. But in the case of my dad, it produced a tormented, unhappy, but wonderful guy who encouraged me to think for myself.
And it feels like there was, despite what you say about it being maybe self-serving, it sounds like there was some genuine compassion there, and also an openness to intellectual, exploration as well. And
oh yeah.
And when you went through that process of asking the questions, was that quite a quick process that you came to some conclusions? Did it focus more on the sort of evidence and reason of this stuff doesn't stack up, or was it more about some of the ethics and the morals that you problematic? And was it a difficult process to go through personally and also with your father and wider society as well?
Not really. I have to say, probably. I haven't thought about it for a while, but probably I started questioning things as a result of reading science fiction. There's a classic novel by Robert Heinlein, putting aside the problematic aspects of his writing, he was a man of his time, called Stranger in a Strange Land, which was also in some ways a problematic, but I was like 11 or 12 when I read the novel. And it wasn't nearly as influential on me as any of John Brunner's works, for example. But as Heinlein's characters tend to do, his characters would start being talking heads and lecture the reader about things. And one of them was, he introduced me to what an asshole the Old Testament God was, how God would send bears down and to disembowel 42 children because one of them laughed at Elisha's hairstyle, this sort of thing. So that kind of opened my eyes to certain pernicious aspects of the scripture that for some reason had never really been mentioned in Sunday school. So I would bring these things up to Dad, and he introduced me to the idea of progressive revelation, which was the idea that back then people were so primitive that they could only understand the idea of a vengeful God. But then Jesus came along, and after Jesus came along, you had this New Testament reinterpretation. It was like the gritty reboot of Battlestar Galactica, except the other way around. The gritty reboot was at the beginning, and then the shiny disco Glenn Larson version of Battlestar Galactica comes, and that's Jesus, and he says all this peace and love, and you probably shouldn't do an eye for an eye. And then, so I poked around a little bit. But you got Paul here talking about the heads of the little ones being dashed against the rocks. That's New Testament. So again, the fact that he would engage me, the man, again, he founded this school. He actually taught biblical scholarship. So the man was no fool. Interestingly enough, he didn't know about Leviticus. When he came out to me, it was like, dude, how can you possibly be a Christian? You know that your own sacred texts say that you should be stoned to death as an abomination. And he was like, no, it doesn't. I had to actually pull out a copy of his own Bible and show him Leviticus. And it was like, whoa. Yeah. And he was like, he had managed to compartmentalize. A man's entire existence must have been one extended case of cognitive dissonance. I don't know how he pulled it off.
Yeah. Amazing.
But yeah, so it was a combination of me learning just enough from science fiction novels to be an asshole to my dad, and my dad taking me seriously and engaging, and then me going back and looking for more evidence so that I could be an asshole. And eventually, of course, as soon as I started getting any kind of scientific training, it became abundantly clear. So it's not like I woke up one day with a bolt from the blue deciding I was an atheist. It was like I was a Christian, but then I was like, I believe in God, but I don't believe in these Christians are complete assholes.
Yeah.
And then it was like God doesn't really explain anything. Saying that God does it, you might as well say magic elves did something. It makes much more sense to just say we don't know. And then I got introduced to the idea of the God of the gaps and how useless that is. And various other philosophical things. So by the time I considered myself an atheist in high school, but I didn't consider religion to be actively pernicious until I was in my first year of undergrad, when I started reading some of the stuff and realized, there are some pretty nasty go forth, fill up the world with thy number, take it under your control. There are some instructions that the Bible gives you that are basically tantamount to putting a toddler in charge of a 747 and telling them to push the buttons.
Yeah.
And at that point, I became not just indifferent to Christianity, but profoundly anti-religious.
Yeah, it's a really weird combination, isn't it? Because in a way, there's rich veins of compassion that flow through most of the world's religions, but there's some also god-awful, deeply immoral stuff. The story of Abraham is a central one to three of the biggest religions around the world. And the central message is, if God tells you to kill your own child, that is a morally good thing to do. So just crack on and do it. I find that viscerally shocking.
Well, it's not the place of the clay to question the intention of the potter.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah,
one of my previous guests put it in an interesting way. She grew up Muslim and had a very traumatic escape from a family situation and the religion as a whole. But she almost said, look, it's not actually moral. It's put as something that's even more important than morality, right? So most people have a common sense view of morality that needlessly causing harm is bad. This is placed on a completely different level. That just, okay, that's just morality. This is what's correct. It's less about what's right. It's more about what's correct and incorrect. And it was almost a different level.
I both agree and disagree with her on that. I think that morality is not about what's right and wrong. I think what's correct is very often that which most would consider amoral or immoral. The things that I like to think that even though we are all motivated by gut level morality, what we should be aspiring to is ethics.
Yeah.
But in terms of religion being paradoxically both full of compassion and contempt. There's nothing fundamentally, religion is basically, I think, a biological epiphenomenon. There are reasons to believe that our belief in supernatural entities in the first place are the result of a category error that emerges from an ancient predator avoidance response. If you look at the love for your neighbor that you are supposed to have in most religions, you find that Christ's hanging around with prostitutes and tax collectors notwithstanding, and talking about turning the other cheek and walking the second mile. You do find that the one thing that religions tend to be extremely intolerant of is other religions. And this is all entirely consistent with just things like oxytocin production. Oxytocin is widely, regarded amongst the public as a cuddle molecule, right? You got these meadow voles up in the Yukon that mate for life, and it's because they got really high oxytocin levels. And I played with that as a background color for some of my stories, where in order to maintain sexual fidelity, you snort oxytocin like it's a nose spray, just in order to maintain fidelity with a partner that you would otherwise leave in a second. There's some autobiography there, but what is a little less known is that oxytocin not only increases kinship bonds, it also amps up antipathy towards other tribes.
Outgroups.
The things that are closest to you, you love more. But as a result, the flip side of oxytocin is that it makes you hate things that are outside the group. And I find that remarkably consistent with how we as humans generally behave on a societal level. I find that once you strip away the rhetoric that our neocortexes have managed to pretzel together to justify why we are behaving exactly like sticklebacks and deer and lumpfish. But no, we are not really like that. We may superficially be doing the same things, but we are not fighting over resources. We're spreading democracy. We are not mate guarding. We are fulfilling God's word. Like, there are all these reasons that we invoke. But once you strip away the chrome on the rationalization, you find that on a population level, we act pretty much like any other mammal. And it goes a long way to explaining why certain people refuse to accept the reality of climate change, why certain people are young Earth creationists, because being right in an evolutionary sense about esoteric things is not nearly as important as having the esteem of your social group. Nobody ever achieved exalted social status by saying, you guys are all fucking morons. This is the truth, and here's my evidence. The moment you do that, you become a latte-sipping, arugula-munching elitist, and they want to lock you up. And there's all sorts of studies that go to this, that, in fact, college-educated Republicans tend to be more likely to deny climate change, even though they're more educated, because they have more sophisticated tools for twisting the evidence.
Yeah, the post-rationalization, the telling the story to justify...
A Joe and Josephine Sixpack wouldn't know what homo or heteroscedasticity is statistically. But if you happen to have a certain amount of background, you can say things, well, if climate change is real, why are the satellite readings on surface temperature inconsistent with the ground-based readings? Why is there global warming on Pluto? It obviously has nothing to do with us. You can learn enough. The point of rhetoric, the point of argumentation is not to come to an empirically sustainable or legitimate conclusion. It's a means of social control to either get other people to follow you or to make other people think that you're part of the crowd so that you will be protected.
Yeah.
And when you think of people as mammals in that sense, a lot of stuff that just seems batshit insane suddenly makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I agree. And would it be true to say you moved away from that sort of religious way of thinking completely? Were you ever tempted by any other forms of supernatural, mystical, magical stuff? My guess is no, you're pretty hard down the line naturalistic. But
I don't know if you'd call it supernatural. I have a soft spot for this guy called Bem, who's the only person to my knowledge who has published peer-reviewed evidence of psionics, basically using time-traveling snuff porn. This is new to you?
Yeah. I must admit that's the first time I've ever heard the phrase time traveling snuff porn. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, the argument was basically the test was one in which it was forget these wavy lines and stars and circles. Those are abstract figures. If there is such a thing as psychic ability, it's gonna probably be most manifest in areas with survival implications. So the imagery they used that the presumed clairvoyant would have to test in on involved basically things to do with death and with sex. And you had to make a guess about the nature of that stimulus before the stimulus occurred. So essentially you had a time traveling thing. You had to basically look into the future. And they got results that were more statistically significant in some cases. And you only need one case to blow the lid off the whole. If you can prove telepathy, much less time traveling snuff porn, in even one case, we've got some serious rethinking of physics to do. And their statistical results were stronger than we necessarily used in order to pass drugs for human use. And there's been problems. People, of course, immediately, like one of the reviewers said, I don't believe these results for a second, but I can't find anything wrong with the methodology.
Yeah.
So I've got to recommend publication. And other people tried to replicate it. Some were able to, others didn't. It remains highly controversial. But I think if something like that turns out to be the case, it's what many people consider a supernatural event.
Yeah.
I would not consider it supernatural. What I'd say is, wow, we don't know everything yet. And isn't that kind of what science is all about? Yeah. You know?
And I think it's almost tautological, right? If you find evidence of something supernatural, it's no longer supernatural, right? Because you've naturalistically detected something. And I agree. I think sometimes there is this sense, and it comes through in a lot of these conversations, that a naturalistic or a scientific worldview can come across as arrogant, almost dogmatic in its own. We have the evidence, we've done the research, we have all the trial results. Whereas actually the heart of naturalism for me is that radical open-mindedness, always ready for new evidence, provisional, probabilistic, and being comfortable with not knowing and just working to find out. So
the problem with that is that it makes us extremely vulnerable. Pardon me. To the hard-assed fundamentalists in our midst. There's a guy called Z he and his buddies back in 2011 did a piece of network analysis in which they suggested that boneheaded, inflexible fundamentalism will become the mainstream position of any society in which boneheaded, inflexible fundamentalists comprise at least 10% of the starting population. And their basic argument was that an empiricist, by definition, is somebody who has to consider the possibility that they could be wrong about anything.
Yeah.
And that a fundamentalist, by definition, is somebody who is absolutely convinced with certainty that their position is correct. So when those two factions butt heads, which one is more likely to change their mind?
Yeah. And the fundamentalists have great stories, better slogans, compelling strap lines, emotional commitment.
It's easy to fit God and certainty onto a bumper sticker, isn't it?
I think it is. You've touched already on this link between what's real and the second question we like to ask about what matters morally. And I guess there's a couple of ways of approaching that question. And you've already talked about some, which is one, where does morality come from? And I'd share your view. In pre-human animals, there was some form of proto-morality through kin selection and tribal loyalty and reciprocity and so on. And in a way, we've just got that similar kit along with all the other mammals. And of course, we've got different cognitive abilities and we've got ability to refine it and mess about with it. But the basics that we've been given in terms of where our morality came from has much in common with the rest of the animal kingdom. But I guess there's also a separate question, which is the evolutionary history and the natural history of our morality doesn't mean it's good in a moral sense, in an ethical sense. And you already mentioned that sort of jump to say, in a way, that's less interesting. What you're interested in is ethics. And for some people, the reason why they're hesitant to move away from a religious or a supernatural worldview is because it gives them some form of moral grounding. And there's a list of rules, there's a deity who will judge you, there's punishments. But without that, when we put a naturalistic worldview to one side and we're just living in a naturalistic world, what can the grounding for morality be? So I guess there's two questions I'm interested in asking here. One is, what would you say is the grounding of your morality if you have one? What matters and why does it matter? And then the second question we can come on to is, okay, on that basis, which types of entities matter? Anthropocentrism, sentientism, ecocentrism, biocentrism. And how have you gone through that journey in your life as well? So there's two very big questions.
It's being brutally honest, my morality comes from where everybody else's morality comes from. I am fonder of kittens than I am of banana slugs.
Yeah.
I am more likely to watch a documentary on the Florida panther than I am on the eastern beach tiger beetle. But that, at the same time, I recognize that it's absolutely fucking obscene that the Florida panther and the eastern beach tiger beetle were both equally endangered. And the panther got $11.3 million for conservation efforts, and the beetle got $513. We are what we are. And I think to some extent the line I used to trot out in situations like this up to about 2 months ago, and I'm sure you've heard it. It's nothing, I'm not inventing this, but we are essentially programmed by instincts that were adaptive 50,000 years ago.
Yeah.
When we had to grab everything we could, when pathological greed was essential to survival because resources were limited and we were always in danger of being eaten by tigers or felled by disease. And when we were at the mercy of our environment, we had to be ruthless. And that's where a lot of this, my baby is the most important thing in the world and nothing is more important than family. And
like you say, it's where the positive stuff about in-groups comes from, but also the negative stuff about out-groups, right?
But even the negative stuff about out-groups is adaptive in a certain environment.
Yeah.
When your tools reach the point that you can basically wipe out an entire biosphere, the same instincts that helped us survive against insurmountable odds threaten the universe or threaten the rest of the world with insurmountable odds. We haven't outgrown, our technology has improved vastly, but it's still being run by caveman brains. And natural selection has no foresight whatsoever. And that means we really have no foresight whatsoever. There's a thing called hyperbolic discounting, which is if there's one thing I could change in human nature, this would be it. The idea that if you give somebody a choice between $10 today and $20 in 2 weeks, oddly, most people will take $10 today because the future is not as real. A future payoff does not strike us as real. And in evolutionary terms, that makes perfect sense because you never know. The guy who is offering you the roast ox or the $20 could get hit by a bus in 2 weeks. In an unpredictable environment, a bird in the hand worth two in the bush. But as the environment becomes more stable, as we can rely on these things, as we become more powerful and less vulnerable to those sorts of happenstance events, what happens is we still have the hyperbolic discounting, but it makes us absolutely incapable of internalizing future catastrophe. So if you give somebody a choice between inconvenience and lower employment today versus ecological catastrophe in 10 years, once again, just like with the money, most people will choose ecological catastrophe in 10 years because it's 10 years away. Somebody's going to come up with something. It's probably just a Chinese hoax, whatever. And so that is where our morality comes from. It is gut level adaptations that have become maladaptive in our current environment.
And that makes me think of a couple of different approaches, because on the one hand, you can then say, as you just did, right, the morality we've got that we've evolved is maladapted for our current environment. So we need to maybe redesign it so it fits, just from almost to help us catch up evolutionary in terms of fitness. So in a way, that's different from thinking about ethics or morality in a classical philosophical sense, which is what is good intrinsically in some way, which is almost thought of independently from whether or not it's evolutionary fit. Do you see there's a distinction between these two ways of thinking? Do you think there's any value in the latter? Or is it really just about, look, we have the potential to be in a post-scarcity state and we have these existential risks. So now, just for our own survival, we need to develop our morality? I
guess the question is, you use the word good, but what is good?
Yeah.
What we interpret as good, again, is a gut feeling. Yeah. Follow your heart. I'm in love. That's good because I've got a certain rush of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators cruising through my system. A mother rescues her baby from a burning building, that's good because that's mother love and nothing's more important than family. A mother rescues two strangers from a burning building and lets her own baby die. Is that good? She saved two lives, but she's let her baby die. Now, this is a classic contrast between what's ethical and what's moral. What do you think the average headline is going to read the next morning? Is it going to read, noble mother sacrifices child to save two strangers? Or is it going to be monster mom leaves baby to die in burning house? The thing that feels good is the thing that worked in a primitive situation. And so I don't know if what's good is actually even a meaningful question, because that's just basically saying what produces a certain mix of chemicals in your brain.
Yeah.
And the thing that produces that wonderful flow of chemicals, as we have already established, may have been good in the past, but it is not necessarily good now. Instincts are, I'm reading a book now called The Hidden Spring by a guy called Mark Solms. I'm about halfway through, and he claims to have actually solved the hard problem of consciousness. I remain skeptical, but he certainly made me think into more interesting and different ways than any other book on consciousness I've read, say, in the past 10 years. So I'm fascinated by this book. And he points out one of the takeaways I'm getting from this is that instincts and gut feelings, we tend to deride them as simple brainstem responses. I'm kind of starting to come around to the idea that, yes, they are simple brainstem responses, but they are distillations of much higher cognitive level events. And the example he uses is latchkey urgency. You know how you're coming home on some big level, you got to take a leak, but what are you going to do? Piss your pants? As soon as you turn the key in the door and you know that the bathroom is just the other side of that door, all of a sudden you can't hold it. You just desperately have to. That's just the mind weighing up various needs and deciding which one's going to get attended to. By the same token, I wore a pair of Blundstones for too long yesterday, and I've, as a result, got an abrasion on the back of my heel. And as a result, every time I take a step, it hurts. But if I was suddenly mugged or if a bear jumped out at me, I would immediately forget about that pain and I would run like hell. So what a lot of these brainstem instincts do is distill various modules of the brain running calculations about what the body needs at a particular time. They basically, and then there's this thing in the brainstem that says, okay, well, we're going to give priority to this thing now. So it's not as simple as it seems, but it manifests as just a simple gut feeling. The problem with that is that it works fine, again, in simple situations. But the more complex the environment you're in, the more likely those feelings are going to be unrealistic.
Yeah.
And what feels good now, eating a lot of sugar now, is not going to keep you alive. It's going to give you tooth-rot, diabetes, and morbid obesity, because all of a sudden there is no shortage of high-calorie foods to be had.
Yeah, no longer fits the environment.
Yeah. So those are the things I think we got to change. And I don't know how we can do that without rewiring human nature at a neurological level.
Yeah, it's tricky, which might be an option. We have a certain level, we certainly have a certain level of plasticity, but yeah, we might need some help there. And I think,
unfortunately, the only people that are going to have the resources to do that are the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world. And I can imagine the way they would choose to rewire the rest of us might not be entirely in the greater good.
Potentially so, potentially. And in a way, a lot of the challenges you framed, this sentientism idea is almost cheating because it's stepping back from a lot of those difficult problems. And it almost says, look, in a way, it doesn't really matter what sentience is, what the nature of it is. Personally, I think it's really just a class of advanced information processing. And other sentientists disagree, right? We have panpsychists and we have other people who, think it's a different thing, right? But it's almost saying it doesn't matter what it is, but that is what matters morally, in a sense, in that ultimately, every good or bad thing comes back to the quality of a sentient experience, whether we call it suffering being all of the bad stuff, flourishing being all of the good stuff. So in simple terms, it says, personally, I don't think there's a sort of platonic moral truth out there at all, but it feels like a sensible naturalistic grounding to say, good things are flourishing and bad things are suffering, almost tautologically, and that's the baseline. And it also doesn't suggest what's the best ethical system, right? Because there are trolley problems and trade-offs like the one you explained. There are deontologists and virtue ethicists and utilitarians and consequentialists, and you can fight over philosophy for as long as you like, and many people spend decades, hundreds of years doing it. But it almost backs away from that and says, look, there's loads of difficult trade-offs. But let's define the boundary of which entities we should at least care about morally based on sentience and our judgment about their ability to have these experiences, which in practical terms leads me not to worry too much about this coffee cup because I don't think it has an experience. But you or I or the puppy behind me or the pig or the chicken or the fish, they have, we think, based on our current science, they have experiences. Those experiences have a positive or a negative valence or quality. And I guess sentientism is just saying morality is the decision to care about that. And you can think about to what degree, but that's the suggestion. It's almost like a naturalistic grounding for it.
Let's run with that suggestion. It's very similar to the position of the antinatalists, with whom I have a certain amount of sympathy, who argue that everything we decide is good or bad, as you suggest, ultimately it all comes down to axioms. We're going to have to just agree axiomatically that we start from the presumption that, in the case of the antinatalists, suffering is bad.
Yeah.
Now they go from, so the imperative, whether you want to call it a moral, a ethical, or simply utilitarian perspective, is that we must reduce the amount of suffering. Obviously, the way you do that is by wiping out all sentient life. Another possibility is, okay, if life is suffering, the most moral / ethical thing you could do, if what we are talking about is care for positive experiences for sentient beings, supposing you could flip a switch and everything with a brain stem, which is to say everything that is conscious in some way, was suddenly basically just flooded with neurotransmitters like dopamine that produce a pleasurable response. Dopamine is probably a bad example because it's actually more associated with addictive reward seeking. I think it's the nerves that fire that create the pleasure sensation. I'm not a neurologist, so I don't know. But you're familiar with the old experiments in the 60s where they basically they wire-headed the rats into their pleasure centers, and these rats just basically played the slot machine until they died of starvation. Not a very fit response, but they did not suffer, as far as we know. They died in absolute ecstasy. So starting from the position that we must value sentient beings and we minimize their suffering, if you can flip a switch that basically turns us all into that kind of a wirehead, do you feel good about that? Is that a solution to the problem? You have eliminated suffering amongst sentient beings. And even better than that, but you've done the antinatalists one better. You've eliminated suffering and replaced it with pleasure as opposed to simple non-existence. So how does that sit in your gut? The idea of basically turning us all into dopamine junkies.
Yeah. And it's an open question, right? And this is another area where the diversity of opinions amongst people who call themselves sentientists is completely dazzling, because there are sentientists who take an antinatalist view. There are sentientists who take a softer version of negative utilitarianism, who still say reducing suffering is more important than enhancing flourishing, but not to the degree where it would take you to an antinatalist point of view. There are others who are also transhumanist. I've interviewed David Pearce, who's another fascinating philosopher, who thinks that we can eventually use, gene drives and drugs and various other types of systems to shift our hedonic set point so that we can be talking about gradients of hedonic bliss, which is a little bit more sophisticated than the wireheading the rats, but ultimately does, unashamedly use technology to shift our baseline so that we do bring suffering to an end without having to end sentient beings. I've played around with those kind of ideas in my fiction. Not so much bringing suffering to an end, but essentially changing the balance so that making environmentally sane long-term choices gives you a dopamine rush. Yeah.
As opposed to basically the argument I've been using is that utopia is on the other side of the fire pit, but you got to walk across the fire pit on bare feet to get there. And because the brain only lives in the present, the moment it puts its feet on the fire. And so I've been playing around with the idea of technology that actually rewires your brain so that you actually get off on having burned feet, as long as it is in the pursuit of a sustainable long-term goal. Yeah. And because so many of our gut feelings are in fact distillations of higher cognitive processes, you can imagine a situation in which that kind of complex cognitive activity, like, is this in fact a long-term sustainable goal? The kind of thing that you wouldn't normally expect to be encodable in an instinct or a drive could in fact be encoded in the things that produce that instinct or drive. Yeah. So I've been playing around with that. I think it's probably more pragmatic to just give everybody that same alpha-gal response that being bitten by the Lone Star tick gives you, so that if you eat a hamburger, you die of anaphylactic shock. That alone would both turn us into cannibals and reduce our consumption of red meat to the point where we could probably buy the earth another 50 years easy. And we already have the Lone Star ticks, and we already have the gene drives. You take that bite and you port it sideways into mosquitoes and horseflies, so that basically anything that gets bitten by one of these insects all of a sudden can't eat red meat without dying.
There's an incentive structure. And I think that's one of the reasons I like this framing of philosophy, because it doesn't pretend to solve all those problems. It doesn't suggest an answer to everything. Is irritatingly neutral on most topics. It just sets that baseline of saying, let's believe naturalistically, and let's, at least in the limit, care about all entities that have sentience. So that leaves so many different problems that are breathtakingly difficult to resolve and work out, including some of the ones you framed there. But it does mean that, at least for super simple problems, there's some direct implications around certain elements of human ethics and human discrimination, valuing all humans equally across different characteristics. It has implications for our ethics around animals as well. I'd argue it implies pretty directly a rapid transition to end all farming. It has implications for our thinking about the environment and ecosystems as well, because it would value them deeply because of their impact on the sentient beings. But it would also directly have compassion for the wild animals in the environment, whereas most of the modern environmental movement seems to exclude concern for farmed animals or wild animals and cares more about granting rights to rivers than they do granting rights to very obviously sentient beings. So on the one hand, it's neutral irritatingly on a lot of topics, but it has quite direct implications for areas where I think we are basically just needlessly causing suffering and harm we don't need to cause.
I have two responses to that. First is, on a gut level, I agree with you 100%. I'm there. The second thing is, though, this position that both you and I believe with all our heart and soul is not rational. It's not reasonable. It's not evidence-based. It's gut-level cuddliness. Human xenophobia, we are perhaps inherently xenophobic. We are not inherently racist. So we start off by imprinting as a kid on the things around us, and the things around us are natural. And so if we are raised in an ethnically diverse environment, we will tend to be far less racist than if we're raised in David Duke's compound and then encounter our first Black person as a Christmas gift on our 13th birthday. It's not the fact that something is different. It's the fact that something is novel and you haven't encountered it during your formative years. And likewise, a lot of people who dismiss the interests of other species just don't know those other species. Like anybody with a cat will tell you these things have personalities, they hold grudges, they have foresight.
They care about family.
Yeah, there is and that's an easy thing to say about mammals. But if you go down to the reptiles, Galapagos iguanas have personalities. They seem to feel a sense of shame. They've got these tiny little pea brains. But I know of a case where there was this one iguana who was always getting the shit kicked out of him by the other iguanas. He had this little tiny territory with one little shrub. And he couldn't defend the shrub. He just wasn't up for it, but it was still in his territory. So he would run around and strut back and forth on the far side of the territory, defending that border. Well, the other bigger iguanas would come in and eat the shrub, and he would just pretend not to see them. Like you would literally see him turn around, catch a view of somebody invading his territory out of the corner of his eye, and he'd look away again and act real tough. There is remarkably sophisticated cognition, even in things that don't have neocortexes. And I was lucky enough to go into biology and have experience with a variety of life forms that has given me a profound appreciation for non-human life.
Yeah.
But if I was, for example, a farmer in an earlier time in which I might have intimate knowledge with my buddy Fred the pig, but I still had to eat. And so it became a matter of survival. Or if I was your average person who lives in a condo downtown, who wouldn't know the difference between a cockroach and a silverfish. Well, actually, that's bad because you do get cockroaches and silverfish.
Yeah, they probably see plenty of those, yeah.
Yeah. We couldn't tell the difference between a dugong and an armadillo. Those people, by virtue of simply not having been exposed to those experiences, will have a different mindset and be far more dismissive. Economic optimists tend to say, yeah, we can continue to feed the world. We just have to wipe out the rest of the rainforests and use it as farmland.
Yeah.
And you and I aren't for that because we know what's like the economists know families, they know people. Those are the things they value. They don't know the rainforest. We do. And it's not, I don't think it's a question of us being better. And I don't think it's a question of us being more rational. I think it's a question of us having had exposure to a different variety of things. I don't know anything about your background. But in my case, there's been a lot of firsthand experience, and if not firsthand experience, at least reading books and articles that make it obvious to me that these other things are more like us than unlike us.
Yeah.
And so I feel a kinship. But again, it's a kinship. It's a tribal thing.
Yeah.
From a purely rational, evidence-based point of view, Jeff Bezos is probably right. He treats his employees like shit. He doesn't pay any taxes. It benefits him enormously. The rest of the world hates his guts, but he doesn't have to worry about the rest of the world because he's going to be the first one on Elon Musk's trip to Mars, right? Like, from a completely rational point of view, empathy doesn't make any sense unless it benefits you. And I reject that, as you do, but we're both rejecting it from the heart. I don't think we're rejecting it from the basis of anything rational. I am upset by the destruction of the environment because I love the environment on a visceral level.
Yeah.
How does that make me any better than anyone else?
And it's a fascinating mix, right? Because there's a super naive view that we evolved to cooperate and therefore there can be an evolutionary rationale for a really nice, heartfelt ethic. And I think there's elements of that, right? We did evolve to cooperate. Cooperation can be useful even in a super selfish way. So you can lead into thoughts about enlightened selfishness, still enabling you to have a positive ethic. But it's naive to take that too far. I think you're absolutely right. And that's partly why, while I do think this sort of commitment to granting moral consideration to all sentient beings, it's grounded in a naturalistic understanding of what those sentient beings are and what it's like, what sentience is likely to be. And in a way, it's, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't either. But it's still just a choice, right? It's just the choice to care about that. It's not something that's driven or it's mandated or there's nothing in a spreadsheet that will force you to have that answer. Ultimately, in a way, ethics is a choice we choose to make, and we can try and persuade each other to have the same sort of ethics. And we can also persuade people that it might be in their enlightened self-interest to agree with our more compassionate ethics, but it's still just a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a problem. It's definitely, this is where we live. And we're fucking the place up. We're using the world as a toilet bowl. It's already biting us in the ass.
Yeah.
So you can definitely make an appeal to complete selfishness for environmental protection. The problem with that is that once you have conceded that ground, once you have accepted that biospheric health can be expressed in economic terms, this is one of the problems I have with people who say, oh, yes, look, at this particular wetland produces $5 billion worth of life support and recirculation of nutrients and so on.
Ecosystem services
Yeah. The moment somebody puts a dollar value on ecosystem services, it's only a matter of time before some developer comes along, flips open his checkbook and says, okay, here's a check for that amount. Now fuck off. We're going to put up a subdivision. And the problem with economics is that it is essentially, it's like Klingon, right? There's a Klingon language. People go to Klingon summer camp. It has its own linguistic rules. It's internally consistent. It's even beautiful. The only thing that Klingon doesn't have going for it is that out in the real world, there's no such fucking thing as Klingon. And to a large extent, this is what economics is. Economics is like kind of Dungeons and Dragons for geeks with MBAs. It is a series of, at least conventional economics. There's donut economics and there's steady state growth economics, and there's people are trying to come, neuroeconomics is a good one. People are trying to rehabilitate the field, but the classical kind of economics that the world still runs on
rational man
has very tangential connection to reality. It's if your relationship breaks up, that's good, because all of a sudden you need to buy 2 refrigerators and microwaves instead of 1. The best thing that happened to the Alaskan economy was the Exxon Valdez crack up, because of an enormous infusion of money that came into that state to try and clean up the oil. Things like mine tailings are considered externalities that just don't, things that produce oxygen are considered valueless because they're outside the economic system. So I have problems with codifying the value of economics in that way, because it can always turn around and bite you in the ass. The system I use, and it's probably rationalization, and ultimately you have to admit nothing really matters. Eventually the universe goes to heat death.
Yeah.
So you have to admit that, but that gives me a little bit of wiggle room, because how long is it going to take the universe to go to heat death? And can we extend that a little bit? And the one thing about life is that it puts the brakes on entropy. In the larger sense, life is an entropy machine. We generate waste heat and so on. But imagine the flow of energy through the universe as a fire hose heading towards dissipation. And then all of a sudden, the volume in that fire hose has to go through a few million capillary tubes instead. Those are trophic networks. Those are physiological systems. Those are sunlight hitting the earth, being converted into energy for plants, being eaten by things. Like, nothing can reverse entropy. There's a phrase out there or a term called neg-entropy, which is absolute bullshit. Entropy will always tend to increase, but you can slow the rate at which entropy increases by pushing the energy through these convoluted little bits of complexity.
Yeah, little eddies in the...
Yeah. There's these little eddies of complexity that sort of these little backwaters in the universe that spontaneously form organization. And sometimes that becomes complicated enough for the thing to wake up. And I find that rare.
Yeah.
In a universe where most of the matter is dark, most of the energy is dark. We don't have any idea what it is, but it doesn't seem to have much in the way of complex structure, where even the baryonic energy, or the baryonic matter that we see, is largely hydrogen and is dissipating and is burning up. The idea of these little knots of complexity, they strike me as rare. And that gives them value for a reason that ultimately does come down to, again, just a gut feeling. But you have to go a few submenus down before you have to admit that it's a gut feeling, because it's physics and it's entropy, and it's expressed in a way that tries to pretend that there is a value to be had in a certain metric, and that metric is structural and energetic complexity. And it's valuable because it's rare, because the universe is not heading towards that it's something that should be therefore protected just because it's anomalous. Ultimately, it's no more meaningful than any other argument, but it's generally one that I can give to somebody over beers and their eyes will glaze over before they hit the point where they realize, wait a minute, you're just saying the same old shit. And so it serves a functional purpose.
Yeah,
I grant that technique to you to use freely without royalties.
Thank you. I will credit you every time I use it. Next time we get out for a beer. And it's interesting because those little entropic entities, eddies that we are, also have the capability to decide about our own meaning and things we choose to care about. And they might be in some ultimate sense arbitrary, but yeah, we can do it, and it's fun to try.
Do we though? There's the whole predeterministic free will thing, right?
Of course,
like we're none of us are responsible for any of the inputs that shaped us. Our neurons don't fire by themselves. Everything is ultimately a reaction. There, you've got the occasional poor bastard who says, "Oh no, but quantum, therefore free will," as if to say, "Yeah, we're not following a flowchart, a predetermined flowchart. We're following a roll of the dice, and that makes us free."
There's no free will, whether it's deterministically driven or probabilistically driven. There's no space for any genuinely free. And a lot of the debate around it, again, many scientists would disagree with me, but
there are still choices to be made. The fact that the choices are not free does not mean that there is still not a branch point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that there are, have you read Ted Chiang's work at all?
I haven't yet, but they're on my bookshelf upstairs. They're in the stack.
His second collection just came out. It's called Exhalation.
Yeah.
And there's a story in that grapples.
I have read Exhalation, actually. I've only read that one.
Right. There's another story I think it might be the last story in the collection. I'm not sure. It takes a while to get into. He has a very workmanlike way of setting up his scenarios. So he doesn't really grab you in the first sentence, but you follow it through, and because he basically does deal with the conceit of parallel universes and the ability to communicate between them, and what that says for personal responsibility, and whether or not it matters what I do in this one, because no matter what I do in this one, there's an infinite number of me, a certain number of dimensions to the side that will do something completely different, and it's all completely meaningless because everything happens.
Yeah.
And he grapples with that perhaps better than anyone I've seen do in fiction. The whole idea of parallel universes has been done to fucking death. But Chang always manages to bring a new spin on things. And I would recommend you read that story, because it actually does come up with, and I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it actually does come up with a reasonably compelling argument for even if there are an infinite number of you doing good, bad, or indifferent things, and even if your choice is therefore technically meaningless, it still matters, and that it can still affect the future of not only your universe, but others for good or for ill. And as a result, it's still something that is worth taking seriously. So I would, if you have a couple of hours to spend, I would read that story.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And we've touched on it pretty richly already, but the final question really is, how do you think about the future? But we've talked about the fact that it's just as adaptive to be conformist with your tribe as it is to really strive for the truth. We've talked about
more adaptive.
More adaptive, yeah.
Although, if it was just as adaptive, we would have a hope in hell.
I'm slightly less cynical there, because I think within groups, of course, I think that plays out. But ultimately, over time, you'd hope that the groups that have an epistemology which is better correlated with reality might do better over time. And you might argue that human progress, such as it is, in a sense, haltingly, is that process of us slowly believing things that are a little bit closer to the way external reality might be. But maybe I'm naive. But
there was a study that came out of 2010, 2011, comparing the lifespans of Israeli communes, both secular and religious.
Yeah.
And it actually found that religious communes had longer expected lifespans than secular ones. And even more frighteningly, of the religious communes, the ones that lasted the longest were the Handmaid's Tale religions, the ones that believed in an angry, surveillant, peeping Tom, the God who sent you to hell for masturbating, who demanded that you subjugate your women, the misogynistic, racist gods. Yeah. Those are the ones, in terms of how long a society is going to last, those are the ones that last longest, much longer than a sort of a mushy, oh, God is love and God will forgive everything thing. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of the things is entry and exit costs. If your God says it's okay whether you pray at home or pray in church or whatever, it's all good, you're going to be much more likely to leave a faith like that than if the price of exit is to be shunned and stoned.
Yeah.
If your price of entry into the club is to give all your money to the church and give your 16-year-old daughter to the guru, not many people will do that. But the ones that do, they're going to be hardcore. They're going to be in it for life.
Yeah.
So you've got that. You've also got the surveillance element that sort of, if you believe that there's something that's spying on you, you're going to be much less likely to cheat. They found that cheating behavior on university exams goes down if you just put a pencil sketch of eyes, stick it on the wall. People are less likely to cheat if they have been told prior to taking a test that there was a girl who died violently in this building, and people sometimes say they see her ghost just down the hall. Like, just that kind of a remark before you start your test, which has absolutely nothing to do with ghosts, murder, or death of any kind, but just planting the seed of some kind of supernatural element surveilling you changes your behavior.
Yeah.
So I am not as convinced as you that we are haltingly making our way to where I think the Enlightenment was a kind of a big blip, and that ever since fundamentalism has been eroding away at it.
Yeah, it's an ongoing battle. That's certainly true. But and I don't know the stats myself, but I think at a higher level of abstraction, when you're looking at nations and you look at theocratic states, for example, or super autocratic states, I don't think they do too well on life expectancy or well-being stats. Or so it's interesting to compare different communes within a wider state and thinking about it at a national level. But yeah, at the very least...
Neither does the US for that matter. If you look at the US in metrics, I've got a slide that I show in some of my talks. There's a paper. It was not a very good paper. It wasn't actually about this, but it produces some really interesting stats about everything from abortion rates, unmarried pregnancy, incarceration rates, murder rates, infant mortality, and plotted them on a line against religiosity. And for 17 different first world nations. And the US was always this outlier. It always had the highest infant mortality and the greatest belief in God, the highest incarceration rate and the greatest religiosity. You have this cloud of data points, and then the US is always up there, sticking out. Yeah. Fundamentally, the U.S. is a third world nation along all of those metrics. But on that said, I think you're right. I think that I like to quote this line about more people in the U.S. believe in angels than accept the reality of evolution. Yeah. That's statistically true. Yeah. Like fully somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of adults cannot answer the question, how long does it take for the Earth to complete a circuit of the sun, even when the answer is presented in multiple choice. That said, I believe the number of people claiming no religious affiliation in the States has increased significantly over the past 10, 20 years. I think it used to be like 85% used to claim religious affiliation. Now I think it's like 83, 82, it's only a couple of percent, but for the US, that's huge. Europe is largely more secular than we batshit insane people are over here. And there's been a fair amount of research that basically says that the more secure you are, the more stable your society, the more likely you are to be secular, that religious belief goes hand in hand with feelings of anxiety. People are more likely to see patterns in random visual static, for example, when they're feeling anxious and afraid and vulnerable. And so people in the US see a lot of conspiracies and a lot of random patterns in random visual static. People in the UK, not so much. I don't know, maybe it's changing now that you've got the water wars and the Syrian droughts and all the environmental refugees pouring in. It could be that things are getting a little more. Plus, you've got droughts that haven't existed across the face of Europe that are like the worst that have been recorded in like over 2,000 years. So it's possible that things are getting bad enough that Europe is now also falling back into religious ways. I don't know. I haven't seen recent stats on that.
I think that generally the secular trend is continuing, even within communities that describe themselves as religious. The level of non-belief and atheism, even within those communities, continues to grow. So in the UK, for example, in the last we've just done a new census, but in the last recent sets of surveys, I think now more than 50% of people in the UK say they're not religious. So
that's awesome.
So it seems to be pretty relentlessly pushing forward.
How are they defending not religious? Are they just saying they don't formally go to church? Or are they saying they actively don't believe in supernatural entities?
It's not quite that clean. So they say non-religious. So they might still have some supernatural views or might still feel that there's some sort of Spinozan type God, or it's not really, the questions aren't asked clearly enough, but they're at least saying they don't affiliate or associate with any of the established religions. So it's not quite a clean, but yeah, it is. It seems pretty a strong trend. We'll see. But can you imagine a sort of more utopian future, whether it's something that we get to by luck or by hacking our own mental structures, or because we hit a big enough crisis that finally forces us to break through that hyperbolic discounting? Can you see a more utopian future for us?
Oh, yeah, I can certainly imagine one. And your solution is, we see an immediate threat. We haven't overcome or broken through hyperbolic discounting. We've just gotten to the point where the threat is so immediate that you're not waiting for the delayed payoff. Ronald Reagan, don't know if you remember him.
Yeah.
Our local right-wing newspaper back in the 80s had a headline, "Reagan assured Gorbachev of help against space aliens." And the picture showed Reagan holding a teddy bear. It was like a mascot of some high school he was at and waving its paw at the audience. And Reagan was a senile old fool, but he was right on that, in the sense that if we are suddenly faced with a common imminent threat, we will band together as a survival response. The problem in our current case is that environmental degradation and climate change it's the flavor of the week, but we've wiped out 80 to 90% of our commercial fish stocks. There's the microplastics issue. There's just basic habitat destruction. There's a lot of things that are as, if not more important than the immediate effects of climate change. People forget that before anyone had heard of climate change, we were in danger of wiping ourselves out with nukes. If we somehow trick our way out of climate change, there'll probably be a gray goo scenario waiting for us 50 years down the road. And who knows? The point is, it's not the crisis that's the crisis. The crisis is human nature.
Yeah.
And so if you fix one problem, then you're still dealing with the short-sighted greed that is ubiquitous to mammals. And I can certainly imagine a situation in which things get better because we can. I have seen examples of people who make those sorts of decisions. I wish fewer people would have children. I know the population we're heading into declining territory in terms of growth rate now, but you still, one first world person has such a huge carbon footprint that we really need to cut back a lot on our population. I think we can do it. We just don't fucking bother to. I see Biden's election. Biden turned out to talk so much stronger a game than anybody gave him credit for. I got to say, I was blown away when all of a sudden Biden is jumping up and saying, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to agree the green. He's not calling it a green deal, but let's face it, it is. His commitments to mitigating climate change are right up there. Forget about the fact that he probably won't be able to do anything about them because the Republican opposition will stymie him at every turn. The fact that somebody who was considered a middle of the road conservative caretaker has become so, I hate to say radical because that implies it's Looney Tunes, that's so realistic, so progressive. It can't help but give you hope. And then all of a sudden, everybody else is jumping on board. Oh, yes, China is going to go carbon neutral. And then this paper comes out from The Guardian. I love The Guardian, by the way. It's the only newspaper I actually pay to subscribe to. It cites this study that shows even in the light of all these commitments, and even if every country that's jumping onto the bandwagon saying, yes, we finally agree that climate change requires significant action, even if everybody acts on all of those, we're still going up by something like 3 degrees. It's still not enough.
Yeah.
The ice is still melting under the ice shelf in the Antarctic glaciers. Yeah. If that bulwark gives way, you could see up to 0.5 meter rise in sea level almost overnight because you've got this ice shelf that is holding back a bunch of other ice that will just slide down into the. So I'm torn because every now and then I see evidence that we at least acknowledge that something has to be done.
Yeah.
Every now and then, I don't think too many people actually deny climate change anymore. They're still trying to delay it. They're still trying to greenwash it. They're still trying to, but there has been progress. And every time I see progress, a little part of my heart goes, thump-a-da, thump-a-da, thump-a-da. Maybe we could go, because I don't want the world to end, honestly. But then when you actually go and you run the numbers, you say even the best case scenario, it's like, hey, look, we've got the Titanic. We've changed the course of the Titanic by 2 degrees, and another 50 kilometers will miss the iceberg entirely. And the problem is that the iceberg isn't 50 kilometers away. The problem is the iceberg is like 50 meters ahead. And the problem with the idea of us all suddenly realizing that there's this threat and working to save it is that the threat doesn't manifest on a gut level.
Yeah.
Thermal inertia on a planetary system is so slow and the time lags are so great that we could stop putting carbon into we could drop our carbon emissions to 0 tomorrow. And temperatures would still go up globally 3 to 5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, because we're not taking into account things like methane tipping points in the permafrost. And I'm not an unhappy guy. I'm happier than I should be. I'm actually pretty happy.
Yeah.
I am happy with my home life. I'm happy with my relationships. I can see the effects of climate change just in my backyard, but it hasn't hurt me yet. Even this pandemic hasn't really impacted my income. So I have been way, way more fortunate than I deserve to be. And because we as a species are delusionally optimistic, It's a whole other issue for which there are evolutionary reasons. And because I am human, of course, I see a better environment. I see us actually doing something. But at the same time, I wonder if it's not already too late.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, we are starting to see the effects now. And that means that the ship has sailed. And that means that the time lags will take us 40, 50 years before before anything we do now will show any kind of an impact.
Yeah.
With the possible exception of methane mitigation. And there are carbon sequestration plants running in Iceland. And people are saying, this is great. Because you have to suck carbon out of the air. You can't just stop producing carbon. You have to get rid of the backlog.
We've got to go negative, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And there is technology that'll do that. But that technology has to be scaled up by a factor of, I think, something like 630 million times, just to keep abreast of our current emissions without even putting a slight dent in the backdrop. So when you look at it empirically, as a species, we're not fucked because we're a pest. We're a pest species. As a high-tech species that gets to play VR and PlayStation and have these kind of wonderful Zoom chats, I see us heading into an age of feudalism simply because there's not enough energy left to keep food. Prices of food have started to increase again. The green revolution is behind us. Desertification it hasn't hit me yet. And I am in as much denial on a gut level as anyone else. So I'm still happy.
Yeah.
But if I was capable of internalizing what my brain is telling me, I would be scared shitless.
And that's one of the interesting things that's flowed through a lot of these conversations, both on the sort of epistemological side and the ethics side and the practical problems of climate change and animal farming and various other, challenges, is quite often the answer technically is actually pretty straightforward. But I think you summed it up really well, which is the crisis is human nature. It's just our inability to think, to work through, to have the will, to spend the money, to take the decisions, to do. Quite often the answer is staring us in the face. It is just human nature getting in the way. So therein lies the hope and the despair and the frustration. But it's been fascinating to talk to you. I find your work deeply inspirational. I think quite often there's better philosophy in sci-fi than there is in actual philosophy. I think just this sort of
that is not a word I am used to seeing associated with my writing. I don't know if you're being ironic or
no, I'm not right. And
inspirational in quotes.
This is maybe my breathtaking naivety and optimism flowing through, but even in blind sight, I can still detect compassion and caring underneath all that. So.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of compassion. But blindsight is, again, delusionally optimistic. Blindsight not only suggests that we're going to have a high-tech civilization in 2080, it implies we're going to actually be able to travel to the Urt. Like, that is, to some extent, that was an overreaction because my earlier stuff predicted stuff for 15 years in the future, and some of that stuff started coming true before the book was even published. So I decided, okay, I'm going to crank down my horizons just so that my book isn't obsolete as quickly. But yeah, Blindsight is considered by many a pretty dark volume, but for all its and Echo Practia's prognostications about the nature of the environment in 2080, and then the end of this century, it still posits that we are going to have a high-tech civilization 50, 60, 70 years from now.
My 247 subscribers here will be listening to your words of wisdom at the very least.
Yeah, and the NSA.
Yeah, and the NSA, of course. Hi, NSA. Hope you're finding this interesting. I bet they're watching it on double speed as well. Outrageous. Yeah. Cheats. So how can people best find you, find your website, your blog, buy your books, apart from obviously from bookshops?
Just look for my website is rifters.com. A lot of my backlist, probably up to most of my short stories are available for free on my website. Most of my novels are available for free. Not the most recent couple. If you happen to speak a different language, I'm out in about 21, 22 different languages now. And I should blog more because I'm not on social media. I'm on Facebook, but the only reason I'm on Facebook is because I got sick of people saying, hey, did you see what this doofus said about you on Facebook? And there's no way of searching Facebook without actually being on it. So I do that, but I hardly ever post there.
So you can follow your own trolls.
I used to blog like weekly or more, but now it's like a couple of times a month because I just have other stuff to do and I have to make a living. But yeah, if you're interested in my fiction or even my nonfiction, I've got I got a couple of, just go to my website. Just go to my website, go to the backlist, and download stuff to your heart's content.
Yeah, and maybe buy a few things too. I'll include the links in the notes as well, so people can find
by all means. Yeah. But if you do decide to buy something, and I'm certainly not encouraging you not to buy, because I got to eat. But try to steer clear of the Amazons of the world. And if there are any like actual bookstores left when this is open, maybe patronize them. Here's a thought.
A nice closing thought. Peter, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
It has been a blast. I enjoyed it. Anytime.
Yeah, thank you. Stay in touch.
Yeah, I will. You first, though.
Absolutely. Take care.